Well, good morning. I'm Dwayne Hoskins. I am the Executive Director of the Palmetto State Chiropractic Association. I've been in practice 25 years. I did graduate from Logan College of Chiropractic in St. Louis in 1992. So, in a week from the time of this recording, it'll be my 25th anniversary of my graduation. So, what I'm called to do, what I've been asked to do, is to further elaborate on the freshman text out of Stevenson's 1927 classic textbook, Green Book. And so we're going to go on from here. So you can see the title of the presentation is Universal Intelligence, Innate Intelligence, Mental Realm, Creation, Transformation, Propulsion. And if you're familiar with the normal complete cycle, you'll see there's one missing, and I'll explain that in just a few moments. Uh, this is a very, very complex and controversial set of topics. We'll cover that also as we go through this. I will be covering it at the freshman text level. I know that in the sophomore, junior, and senior text levels, Stevenson goes into much, much, much more detail on these and elaborates his thoughts. But we're just going to be staying with the text. So in Stevenson's, we're going to be starting with the concepts here, the normal complete cycle. And again, we're covering these in the cycle. We're still in the left side or the center side of the cycle. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And if you look at my diagram, which I introduced in the last recording, this is taking the same cycle and just kind of putting it into visual form that I think about. So I have universal intelligence, which is outside of the body. Well, it's actually all-encompassing. So that box right there should be beyond the borders of the slide. But for this presentation, we're just going to leave it right there. The brain is within inside the body. That's actually a physical location. Innate intelligence, we decided last time, is located and does its function there in the brain cells itself. We'll talk about that here in a second too. And it coordinates its actions through the brain cell. And then we have the cycle down here, which is what we are familiar with in simple layman's term as the safety pin cycle. And then we also know that subluxation and the adjustment only happens here, and so therefore chiropractors with their adjusting thrust, this is the only place we have effect. And then it completes the cycle through the tissue cell, back through the afferent nerve, transmission back to the brain cell, and then it coordinates with the innate intelligence, and back to universal intelligence. We talked last time about cycles having to start and end at the same point, and that's why that is there. And Article 37, which is where we're going to be now, talks about the normal complete cycle. And basically, it is the outline of the story of normal function. As you go through Stevenson's textbook, if you've been through it before, you know that there's plenty of other abnormal cycles that are talked about. So we have an efferent and an afferent side of the cycle. This right here again is just an outline of the same diagram we had before. But what I've done here is I've taken and put up here the main categories, but down here it helps me to understand where things happen. So once we get outside of this non-physical area, brain cell, this is what happens in the brain cell. This is what happens in the efferent cell. This is what happens in the tissue cell, all the way over to here, the afferent nerve, and then back to the brain cell, and then it goes back into the non-physical. So this is just how I break down that normal complete cycle so that I can understand it a little bit more clearly. And again, what we're talking about today is this part. And I did skip mental impulse, and I'll tell you about that. We're covering this as a state association in order. And Dr. Myron Brown, who's a legend in these parts of the world in chiropractic, covered mental impulse all by itself in the previous session of the Ignite series here in South Carolina. And he did a masterful job at doing that. And he actually had a presentation that I'm just guessing, but he had at least 200 references from all kinds of books, some I've never heard of before. A lot of them I was familiar with, but he just did a masterful job. And that recording, if it's not available through the ACP or through Sherbin's online CE course, we may have that available at the Palmetto State Chiropractic Association website and education portal. But it's something in and of itself. So that's kind of why I skipped that, because it was already done and there's no way I could even touch what Dr. Brown did. Again, here's the cycle. Right now we're going to start and talk about the universal intelligence, which is the first part of the cycle. Bear with me as I go through this, because this is not going to be easy, and there's a lot of controversy about universal intelligence within the higher echelons of chiropractic. In fact, I could probably bet that a lot of the DPHCSs and the PHCs and the ACPs and the LCPs all could have been gotten, a vast majority could have been gotten, just talking about this one topic of what is universal intelligence. Let's start with what is written. Let's start with some of the contradictions, and then let's explore the contradictions, because Stevenson was a very smart man, but this is not religion. So there is room for further explanation. There's room for further exploration. And sometimes conflicts brings clarity. And so we're going to work on that as we go along. So what is written? It is written on page 17, Article 49, Stevenson's textbook, that universal intelligence is infinite. And when I think of infinite, I use these two terms, scope and scoop. So infinite in the present instant in scope, or in scoop, I mean it has no limits in the amount of work or the amount of space it fills or the amount of power or anything else. And scope is more of a temporal thing, so it's infinite in its duration. So when I look at scope and scoop, it's filling up all the dimensions you could possibly think about, and then some, when we talk about the term infinite. This next phrase is something that caught me, and I've always had trouble with, but I've learned to deal with it and reconcile what's written with what was thought and other passages and other writings and other books that DD and BJ and Stevenson and other leaders of our profession have written. But on page 17 it says, by definition, universal intelligence is God, and we'll deal with that in just a little bit. It's also written here in the text that we cannot define it or describe it, and universal's job is endowing living things with localized power, which we call innate intelligence. So that's what's written on page 17. So here's some of the points of confusion. Stevenson writes out clearly, we cannot define it, nor can we describe it. And yet, then he goes on to try to define and describe, not only just at this part, but throughout the rest of the textbook. And that leads to some other conflicting statements. This one by itself is kind of interesting. Another point of confusion is it is not complete without force and matter. We know from principles number 3, 4, and 5 that intelligence by itself is not complete. Intelligence is not force, and intelligence is not matter, and therefore it is not complete without those other three, because the triune of life needs all three. The perfection of the triune needs all three. And the union of intelligence and matter obviously needs all three. Intelligence by itself is not complete and therefore is not infinite. The universal intelligence requires force and matter, both of them, to express life, which is its main function. So just by going through the principles, we can see that universal intelligence is not really infinite. It may be infinite beyond our understanding, but it's not infinite in the absolute sense. And we can see it as it's expressed here. Another point of confusion, solicitude is one of those terms that was used back at the turn of the century, the 19 teens and 20s, and people knew what it was. It means concern. It's an anthropomorphic term, and we see a lot of that anthropomorphism here, attributing human emotions and thoughts and actions to a non-human or an inactive thing. I mean, intelligence is not action. Intelligence is not it's not force and it's not matter, and yet to explain it, we give it these terms and descriptions like solicitude or concern, or it wants to do this, or it desires to do this, or it is tripped up by doing this, or it's interfered with, which is That one we'll discuss later also. But regardless, it is described as having both solicitude or concern. And how has it done this? It does that because its primary function is to endow, well, one of its functions is to endow constructive intelligence through innate intelligence, but it's also, by principle number 11, described as not showing solicitude as one of its primary characteristics. So here we have a snippet from page 17, and it, referring to universal intelligence, endows living things with localized power, innate intelligence, as a higher manifestation of its forces. So that's its job, and we'll see that innate intelligence, one of its job is to construct, to build, to take chaos and make into usable force. And then principle number 7, the forces of UI are manifested by physical laws, are unswerving and unadapted, and have no solicitude. It doesn't really care about the structures in which they work. So if you take a set of keys and drop them off a very tall building, they will fall at a very prescribed rate with friction and gravity based upon when and where and what planet you dropped it. And if you take a cat or a dog or a human and drop it from the same height, the same forces and the same mathematical equations work on the human body or the cat body or the dog body or whatever. And the universal forces, universal intelligence, really doesn't care. Another point of confusion, it endows constructive intelligence, which is innate intelligence, and yet is also a destructive. So principle number 26, in order to carry out universal cycles of life, which is understandable, I hear the Disney, oh my goodness, Lion King song here. The circle of life, the cycle of life, universal forces controlled by universal intelligence are destructive, and innate forces controlled by innate intelligence are constructive as regards structural. So we have a little bit of contradiction here. And Principle 11 says that universal intelligence manifests itself only through universal laws. Therefore, it's limited by itself, even though it's described as not limited. So here in the top, we have this top snippet here. We have a capture of page 17. Being infinite, talking about universal intelligence, no one can define it. Actually, one can only get a finite idea of it from the finite amount of manifestations we are able to perceive in our finite mind. This intelligence is not limited. It is we who are limited in perception, which I completely agree with. But number 11 says the character of universal forces is manifested by physical laws. So here it says it's not limited. Here it says it is limited by the laws. And again, unswavering, unadapted, and have no solicitude for the structures in which they work. This one is out of place. I apologize for that. Nope, I covered it right. I'm sorry. I'm ahead of myself. So anyway, yeah, universal intelligence only manifests itself through universal laws. Therefore, it's limited. If it was unlimited, it wouldn't be constrained by its own set of rules. All right, here's my point of view, and it's one point of view. There's a few people out there that I agree with or agree with me, however you want to say it. It's not the only point of view, it's just me. It's just the way I have to process this to understand it. And that is, universal intelligence is an entity or a set of rules created by their creator, who I call God in my worldview. Universal intelligence is not a person or an entity, but it's the manifestation of what it was created to do. So namely, I believe that universal intelligence is created to govern all force and matter in all of creation. Therefore, universal laws, as we would call them today. And I would also say that universal intelligence is the set of primary laws, physics, math. Now, there are other derivative laws that use physics and math, like chemistry and biology. And some of those, I would say, are part of universal intelligence. No matter where you go in all of creation, those laws are constant and apply equally everywhere. This allows me to keep my worldview and still be a very philosophically based chiropractor. This also meets almost all the descriptions and answers almost all of the contradictions that we presented so far. And it fulfills the definition in Principle 1. So, Principle 1 says a universal intelligence is in all matter and continually gives to it all its properties and actions, thus maintaining it in existence. And I would argue that the physical laws of the universe, even the subatomic ones and the ones we haven't defined or described yet, are what is doing this. It's an intelligence, it's not a force or matter, it's a set of laws. It's how matter and forces interact with each other, and it's governed by these laws. Number 3, the union of intelligence and matter, and again, this fits with my understanding that I just presented. It's a union of intelligence and matter. The triune of life, the perfection of the triune, we've already talked about these. In my understanding of what I just presented, it fulfills these without detracting from the importance of universal intelligence. It also fits with the character of universal forces which are created by universal intelligence to cover universal matter, or all matter, as the forces are manifested by physical laws. That right there is what cemented my understanding in my head that I have to understand it this way. And again, the way I explained this number 11, not having solicitude, also allows me to understand that these are the universal physical laws and not an uncaring creator being that doesn't care if keys or a puppy is dropped off a building. My understanding and interpretation of what a God is, gods can't typically be interfered with if they're infinite in power and scope and scoop. But yet, number 12 says that the universal forces that the universal intelligence create can be interfered with in the transmission through matter. And then it also fits with number 26. Universal forces are destructive and innate forces are constructive. If universal intelligence, which created universal forces, is infinite, it would overpower the innate forces and not allow innate to adapt, which we'll talk about when we talk about innate. Again, this is one man's view, one chiropractor's view. I've only been doing this for 25 years. I've only been thinking about this seriously for the past 10 or 15. And it's not something that was talked about or even presented at Logan when I went through school there. So it's something I've picked up since then. And I've had to merge it, subject it, interject, wrestle with it, according to my worldview. And I think that's appropriate. And again, this is philosophy, and it should be talked about. It's a love of knowledge, and so we should be able to talk about it and explain it fuller without destroying what's been written. Another chiropractor agrees with me. I just have to say that, Dr. Strauss. I don't know if you've heard of him before. Just a guy who has written many, many books. Was a protege of Reggie Gold. Has written what's called the Blue Books, which is his treatise on the Green Books, side-by-side explanation of how a trained philosopher and a very skilled chiropractor and one of my heroes thinks about it. In chapter 8 of his book, No Man's Land, written in 2015, not too long ago, he does cover this same topic, and I highly recommend you go and get that book and read it. Excuse me. All right, so let's get back to this. So that was just the first of these 7 things we're going to be covering today. Some of these are going to go a little bit faster. But the next one we're going to talk about is innate intelligence. Again, what is written, and then we're going to see some contradictions. And again, contradictions or conflicts can bring clarity. And I'm going to go over what's written, and I'm going to go over share some of my thoughts, and you guys can take that and process it as you will. So innate intelligence from page 17 and following in Article 50 of Stevenson's textbook says, innate intelligence is a finite portion of universal intelligence in a finite portion of matter whose mission is to keep that matter in active organization. Makes sense to me. So basically, it's individualized universal intelligence, or the innate intelligence is It's an individualized innate intelligence. It's a segment of the universal intelligence, which, though part of it, is distinct from it. So it's kind of like a little ice cream scoop out of the universal intelligence pool. And its job is to take care of the organism, organelle of what it resides in. Excuse me. So here's what's written. If a number of interdependent parts are to have a cooperative relationship with each other, they must be grouped around a central idea. They must be grouped about a common need, and they must be grouped around a governing principle. This governing principle is innate intelligence. So it's a principle. Now, we speak of the amount of innate intelligence in percentages because both the mouse and the elephant have 100% innate intelligence that they need. And it's that which each has, that amount which each has is the amount required to make them what they are. So that's why we talk about innate intelligence, because the mouse has less quantity, but adequate quantity, if you want to put a number on it, or a number of units. But we don't speak of innate intelligence that way. We talk about it in percentages. So if we look at a diagram here, we have a bacteria, an elephant, a tree, and a human. All of them have 100% of the innate they need to function as they were designed. And that's what that was all about. So what is written? Innate is limited in the amount of matter it controls. So my innate does not control the tree in my backyard. And the tree's innate does not control the functioning of this body. Sometimes that might be better. I don't know. Probably not, because it's not the way it was designed. Innate intelligence is not limited to the amount of forces at her command. Therefore, it does have limited expression based upon the matter that's limited. And the explanation is one cannot do the same amount of work with a toothpick as with a crowbar. So even though innate is a portion of universal, it is at constant war with universal over the state of the matter under their common control. So innate is constructive. We've already talked about this. Universal is destructive. And that's from principle number 26. And you would have to agree that universal being everything and innate being a subset, they have common control over what's in innate's realm. But innate was designed and directed to be constructive, and universal is described as being destructive for that cycle of life, the circle of life thing from Lion King. Now, while actively organic, which is matter that is expressing life, it's not organic in the sense of organic chemistry, but in the textbook, organic matter is described as matter that's expressing life. All of this organic matter has localized intelligence, which we have called innate intelligence. And page 20 here, which I really respect Stevenson, because you know the book is like 975 pages long or whatever. He says he realized now we could talk about innate intelligence in bacteria and viruses and any other living organic matter in trees and plants and insects, but we're chiropractors and we're writing a chiropractic textbook. So from now on, page 20, anytime we speak of innate intelligence, the textbook is referring to human innate intelligence unless it's specifically otherwise stated. And I think that's very wise of him, and I appreciate that, because that way anytime after page 20, if it says innate intelligence, we can't talk about cricket innate intelligence. We're talking about human innate intelligence, and I think that's just a really good baseline to set. Now in Article 43, which we're going to see here in a second, innate intelligence is described as the ego itself. You are your innate intelligence, and your innate intelligence is you. I'll let you digest that a little bit as I ingest a little bit more coffee. Oh, you like my mug? Yep, it's Lilo and Stitch. Anyway, which is interesting because he also talks about, when we talk about the mind, chiropractic does not divide up the mind, the thinking part of our brain, into id and ego and conscious and subconscious. So it's interesting that he uses ego here. But Article 43 clearly states that innate intelligence is the ego itself. You are your innate intelligence, and your innate intelligence is you. Now, again, here's one point of view. This is my point of view. It fits with how I understand the body to work and how I understand the universe to work. Innate intelligence functions as a subset of universal intelligence. So for universal intelligence, according to my understanding and the way I have to think about it, is a set of physical laws, universal laws. If innate is a subset, therefore it is not a person. It's not an entity, and it's not a little voice directing me to think in different ways. Namely, it governs all force and matter in its organism. Now, one of the other things that we need to understand is every organelle and every cell and every tissue and every organ in every system and every organism, every one of those steps has its own innate intelligence. Ribosomes has its own innate intelligence. The Golgi tendon apparatus has its own innate intelligence. The mitochondria has its own innate intelligence. The cell wall has, or the cell membrane has its own innate intelligence. The tissues, the cell, the interstitial fluids, all those particles have both its universal intelligence that it's operating under, and then a coordinated innate intelligence that it uses for the advancement of the organism. So, but we're going to talk about innate for the organism here. There are primary laws, which is the realm of universal, physics, math, chemistry. And there are functional derivatives. These are the realm of innate intelligence. So biology, biochemistry, physiology, kinematics, neurophysiology, well, not anatomy. That's not really laws. That's the study of what the structures are. But you understand what I'm trying to say here. So when you put physics and math and chemistry together, you get biology, you get physiology, you get kinematics, you get all kinds of these derivative laws, and that is the realm of II, innate intelligence. Let that sink in. Again, this is my point of view. You don't have to agree with it at all, and please, if you don't feel like this makes sense to you, happy to either talk to you or happy to disagree with you. This is not something that is set in stone. It's just the way I understand it, so I can deal with it when I'm dealing with the larger picture of chiropractic philosophy, but more importantly, how I explain it to my clients so that to help them with the eradication of subluxation as their body deals with that interference. All right, so we've dealt, we've introduced, we've skimmed over, we've kind of touched and ran away from universal intelligence and innate intelligence. And now we're going to get into the mental part of the cycle. And this has mental, mind, and mental realm. And we're going to cover that here, again, just at the freshman text level. Nothing super deep, but hopefully enough to where we can start understanding how this entire cycle could work. And yes, that is a formal term here in South Carolina, could. All right, so the mental realm is strictly abstract. It is the realm of thought. It is not physical. It's not into force yet. It's definitely not into matter yet. Anything which exists was first conceived in thought. Let me just say that again, because anything, therefore everything which exists was first conceived in thought here in the mental realm. All right, the process of thinking is creation. So if I think, I am creating. Let that sink in, because that's some pretty powerful stuff right there. Thinking is creation. Kind of makes us realize that what you think is who you are. What you think is what you're going to do. All that stuff going on in your brain that you're creating is, even before it reaches the physical realm, that is creation. That is what can become. And that's something we have to be extremely careful about. Have a completely different talk about that. But it's also part of this conversation, so we'll cover that here in just a second. I'm going to pause, so if you see the video jump a little bit, it's because I have to go and take care of something real quick. All right, hope the video didn't jump too much for you. Thank you very much for that brief pause. On my end, anyway. You guys didn't have much of a pause, I don't think. All right, so the mental realm. Every abstract fact, every plan, every structure, every act of every part of the entire body, or the body as a whole, is first created in the brain by innate intelligence. Now, this mind, this mental realm, is not a power in and of itself, but it's the activity of that power or that intelligence. Let that sink in. This is not the easiest thing to understand. In fact, here in a moment, you'll see a statement. The mind, we're out of the mental realm into the mind. This is location. It's the activity. It's not really location. It's the activity of innate intelligence in the brain as the organ. The mind is the introduction of thought into matter via the brain. So we're starting to get from this non-physical realm through force into introduction of thought, these ideas into matter in the brain. And matter is the subatomic particles, the atomic particles, the organelles, the interaction of these individual cells with each other to start the motion of matter. The mind is a term applied to what innate intelligence does when innate intelligence is at work. So this is the mind, and the mental realm is the description of the actions of innate intelligence. The mind, innate mind, and educated mind are terms used to indicate the kind of work being done. We're going to show diagram 4, which B.J. Palmer says is his most favorite diagram in the entire work of Stevenson, the entire realm of chiropractic. Innate mind and educated mind are shown as separate. But here, even on page 21 of Stevenson's, it's not that it's separate in location, it's separate in what kind of work is being done. And we're going to talk about that different here in just a little bit. So hang on. There is a point of confusion here, and I've already addressed this, or at least introduced it, because chiropractic uses the term mind differently than psychology. On page 22, he talks about that. So when we talk about mind, we're talking about the activity of innate intelligence, where in psychology, mind is split into id and ego, conscious, subconscious. Mind is used more of as an organ type of concept in psychology. And that's all I'm going to mention about that. So don't try to bring in psychology into this discussion, because even on page 21 it says we use mind differently by purpose, on purpose, than psychology does. And he actually goes into it a little bit further, but I'm not going to bring that into this discussion. All right, so I want to back up this just a second. Hold on. Well, crud, I can't back it up. My goodness. All right, so let's take this diagram that's already been exposed here to talk about the creation of things. So we have the composer, who I'm liking to innate intelligence. The composer has an idea of what music he would like to hear or would like to have out in the world. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, if you've ever seen the movie Amadeus, it's quite incredible, but he created almost all of his pieces in his brain before he wrote them down, and he wrote them down perfectly. According to the movie anyway, he never ever scratched out a note. He never ever made a mistake in his transcription from his brain to the paper. But still, the music had not been realized yet. There was no musical sound expressed. But what he created was a musical score, the instruction sheet for how that musical sound was to be expressed. That musical score was then handed to a set of musicians. All the musicians, some had similar instruments. There's first, second, third, fourth string violins, there's first and second clarinets, there's the percussion, and so forth and so on. But each musician took that music score, interpreted it, and then took up their instrument and used their skill and specific training with that instrument to actually create the musical sound. Following so far? So innate intelligence gets this impression that it needs to do something. Again, I'm being anthropomorphic. I completely understand. It's just the easiest way to get through this in this type of discussion. Innate intelligence decides that it needs more urine produced, or it needs less of sodium in its body. However you want to decide what it needs to do, or it needs to be able to run a marathon next week because we've been thinking about that for a while, and so it's got this impression we need to have all these things taken care of. So what it does is it creates this score, it creates this instruction on how the entire body, again, this is going to be an organism level innate intelligence. The mind is the action of innate intelligence, putting that plan together. Now, at some point, it triggers something and becomes a mental impulse. So these instructions are sent out to all the organs, all the tissues, all the specific individual cells to implement the plan. And each one takes its own training, its own design, its own specialization to express that thought into life. So this is something that helps me understand that this whole process from pre-thought to plan to distribution and to execution and then expression. And so hopefully this helps you too. No extra charge. All right, innate mind. It's the activity of innate intelligence in the innate brain as an organ, as a place. Well, not really. It's as an organ. This activity produces innate thought or mental force. And the act of assembling forces in the brain is called innate mind. So it's this activity. It's not a thing. It's a description of the activity of innate intelligence, still in the pre-material realm. Innate intelligence controls the functions of the involuntary organs, also known as the innate body, via the innate brain. Now, if you're following along with me on page 23, you'll notice that this is not as what's said here, but bear with me. We'll mention this in a few slides because it does say something very similar about the educated body. It helps us to understand that in diagram 4, BJ's favorite diagram, innate body and educated body are separate in the diagram. And we'll talk about that here in a second anyway. But it does go on in other places to talk about the innate intelligence controlling innate brain, which loops down to innate body. Innate body is the involuntary organs. These are the things we cannot voluntarily control. We can't command I can't command my vocal cords to produce the exact note consciously. I can't say, sing a C right now. Now, I can say, I want to sing a C, and innate intelligence will create that activity and the process and send out the score to the vocal cords. The muscles there will tighten to the precise tension, and with the feedback loop of the ears, or if I'm looking at something or hearing a piano playing, it will vary the tension according to what my intention was, the activity and the thoughts created by innate intelligence and active mind to produce that. But there's a lot of involuntary stuff going on, even in that voluntary action of singing a C or even talking. But we'll talk about that again in just a moment. Here's figure 4. I've been talking about it a little bit. So even when innate intelligence uses educated brain, she must first use innate brain. So let that soak in, and that's what this is doing. Now, one of the things I realized when I first saw this a long time ago, I thought, okay, innate intelligence only goes to innate brain, and then it has to go innate body. before it comes back to innate brain, before it even gets to educated brain or educated body. That's really not what this is saying. It's actually saying it's a two-way street here. It's a two-way street here. It's a two-way street here. And it's a two-way street here. Now, one of the things it does not do, educated body is not directly related to innate brain, and innate intelligence only uses innate brain to get to other places. Okay? So hopefully that helps explain it a little bit. Educated mind. Okay, so we're out of the mental realm. We're out of the innate mind. Now we're into educated mind. Is the activity of innate intelligence in the educated brain as an organ. Now, this activity produces educated thoughts, reasoning, will, memory, etc. Now you have to realize, again, innate intelligence has to go through innate brain before it can get to educated brain. So this is it's still the activity in innate intelligence in the educated brain with all that in place. This is a quote from page 23. I told you we get to it. Innate intelligence controls the function of the voluntary organs, also known as educated body in figure 4, via the educated brain. Okay? So hopefully I didn't just destroy your world and understanding of figure 4, but that's the way I am continuing to understand the diagram based upon other texts, which we'll get to in a moment. Educated mind. Educated thoughts are mostly for adaptation to things external to the body, which leads me to believe that innate mind, innate thoughts are mostly for adaptation to things internal to the body, or something, how the body adapts to changes within the body. Educated thoughts are never outwardly expressed until innate does it. That's a direct quote. Don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger, through innate brain. So innate does it, processes the request. Innate recruits innate body to execute its portion. And again, thought to speech, I'm going to use this as an example. Educated thoughts, if I want to read this to you, I have to take my educated brain to interpret this picture as letters, and this group of letters as words that mean something to communicate ideas, and then I have to, in my brain, formulate these groups of letters called words, and these groups of words called sentences, and these groups of sentences called a slide here in PowerPoint, and I have to formulate how to express that to you in a way that you hopefully could understand. In that process is not just the higher level of thoughts and ideas and communication, but how do the vocal cords work? How does my diaphragm work? How's my posture in the presentation? How am I reacting to my picture down here in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen? And all of that stuff has to be done through innate brain, the involuntary thing. Therefore, educated thoughts are never outwardly expressed until innate processes the request through innate brain, until innate recruits the innate body, the involuntary body, to execute its portion through innate brain. That's how I understand it. I could be wrong. That's okay. I'm okay with that. But reading this word "does it" is kind of confusing, and we'll just leave it there. Okay? Cool. All right, now, ready to blow your mind? In 1942, a good 20 or 15 years later, B.J. Palmer wrote this, The Law of Cause and Cure of Dis-Ease, or The Law of Production and Reduction of Vertebral Subluxation. It was a Lyceum booklet, and so in it, he uses the diagram 4. Again, it's his personal favorite, and he talks about this is how the bottom part of figure 4 works. He doesn't have innate intelligence up here. Actually, he has innate brain here, which innate intelligence resides in. So he says number 1 is innate brain, in which innate intelligence lives in the unit. 2 is innate body, in which innate intelligence expresses and acts for and against all internal function in the unit. See where I'm getting that from? 3 is educated brain, through which education is received and thinks education. And 4 is educated body, in which educated thoughts express and act for and against all internal function so far as so far as it has to do with external environment. Okay, with me so far? So four is a place in, okay, an intelligent thinks in one, and an intelligent acts in two. There's an efferent flow from 1 to 2, and there's an afferent flow from 2 to 1. All right, next one. So he takes this. X right here is a vertebral subluxation between brain and innate body. So that means there must be a vertebral foramen between the two. Interesting. So X is a vertebral subluxation entering between innate brain and innate body, or between innate intelligence and innate function, causing abnormal, unhealthy, reduced quantity of function and flow, reducing quality of life into, which is innate body. So he refers to an X here, but it's actually right here is the X. So it's a vertebral subluxation between innate brain and educated brain. Very interesting because these are both brain. So a vertebral subluxation, causing unhealthy, abnormal, reduced quality of the function of flow to 3, producing a reduced quality of education thought values in 3. And then he says obviously 4 can only do what 3 is capable of doing. Can't do anything more, can't do anything less or anything else other than 3 is allowing it or telling it to do. So if 3 is messed up, 4 by default is messed up. All right. Oh, bummer. He also talks about if it's just a little bit of an interference, it can still be sane. But if it's a whole bunch of interference, this is where we get into producing insanity and has no relationship to sanity in any respect. So this is where he's taking his concepts of subluxation and its effect on the body and the brain to his levels of understanding. Let me get rid of this one too. A is innate body, to innate brain, to educated brain. This is talking about the pain cycle. There's really no pain in the innate body. It's the brain, innate brain's perception of the pain, which it communicates with educated, where we perceive consciously that this thing is called pain. All right, so I think this one is going to blow your mind, the next one, because it did mine when I saw this. And this is the interaction of innates between people, and specifically uses husband and wife. So number 1 is the innate of the husband. Number 2 is the innate of the wife. 3 is a communication from innate of the husband to innate of the wife. And 4 is the return. That kind of just really blew my mind because it's showing here that the person 2, whether it's wife or brother or coworker or whatever you want to put here, acts upon innate brain's awareness of the other person's innate brain's needs. This is quite a totally higher level of thinking. But I wanted to share with you this because it opened my eyes that BJ didn't just say that diagram 4 was his favorite. He acted upon it and he elaborated on it and it took it to whole different levels. And I also wanted to show you that the diagram in 1 and the description led me to believe and still believe that innate body is the involuntary and educated body is the voluntary portion and actions of organs and organelles in the body. All right, back to my diagram of the normal complete cycle. Covered those. Well, we didn't cover them. We kind of barely scratched the surface. And this is kind of where we are from how innate intelligence influences and works on the brain cell. The brain cell is either itself the efferent nerve or it connects with the efferent nerve. So they're separate, even though they may, in any individual instance, be the same. Same thing down here. The tissue cell is typically not the afferent nerve or the sensory nerve, but it interacts with it. But anyway, this is my diagram. We're just going to go on from here. So again, we're going to list the normal complete cycle in outline mode. Let this pop up there while I get more coffee. And again, these are the ones we're at. So we've done, well, we've kind of talked about these two, talked about this, and now we're going to talk about creation. All right, so we know where we're at now. So on page 24 and following, Article 56 of Stevenson's 1927 textbook of chiropractic, creation is the process of adapting universal forces within the brain cell so that they can be used for the maintenance and functioning of tissue cells. So creation is the adapting of forces within the brain cell to be used for maintenance and function of tissue cells. Creation is the assembling of forces within the brain cell by innate intelligence. Now, creation can mean ex nihilo or out of nothing, but in this context, it's not describing creation that way. In fact, it clearly said it's assembling the forces together to create something different, to adapt to. Creation is the assembly into something not there before, both forces and matter. So it's the assembly of forces and the assembly of matter into something that wasn't there before. I really am into watching forging of Damascus knives on YouTube. I don't know if you guys have even ever seen that, but if you take pieces of steel and you put heat and you do that process enough, you end up with a Damascus billet. You take that to the forge, you come up with a knife blank, you heat that up again, and you forge it into a more refined knife blank, and then you take it to the grinder and to the belts and to the hand stones. Eventually you end up with a usable, sharp, beautiful blade. So we take this assembly of loose steel parts, again it's lock washers. We add some heat in a very specific temperature in a very specific way with some intelligence. And we add some force with very specific directed intelligence. And we heat it again. And we pound it again, eventually, and heat it again. Eventually we end up with a billet or a blank of steel that has this beautiful pattern in it. It's called Damascus steel. And after we have that, we heat it again, and we pound it again, and we start making a knife blank. And then we grind it, and then eventually we come up with something totally different, yet not. It is all of the same stuff that was there before. It's just organized in a totally different usable form. Lock washers were very usable. They're in almost everything that we use that has a washer. There's a lock washer component to it. But intelligence took those pieces and reused them, adapted their matter into something that is also useful in a totally different way. Didn't violate any universal laws. In fact, it used universal laws and adapted them to accomplish its goals of creating this knife. So that's a good example that I like to use, and it's also extremely beautiful. So creation, innate cannot change or destroy any universal law or matter. So innate by itself cannot destroy or violate any law or matter. Innate can, however, play one force against the other. Innate can adapt the forces at her disposal in order to accomplish her ends. And it can use the forces, it can oppose the forces, or it can augment the forces. at her disposal in order to accomplish her ends. So anybody that knows anything about flight understands that flying is not anti-gravity. Gravity is still at play. Gravity is still in full force. Flight is using other principles and other laws in opposition to gravity, and actually in tandem and in harmony with gravity, to maintain altitude with lift and propulsion and other things, so that you have flight, even though gravity, in our primitive understanding of gravity, would say no, it has to be on the ground. So just because we can fly doesn't mean gravity doesn't exist. It just means an intelligence used other forces and other matter in a specific way to overcome, to oppose, to adapt to gravity, and actually use gravity to create flight. Does that make sense? So that's creation. It's not destroying universal laws, it's adapting and using those forces with and against and in harmony with each other to accomplish the goal. Creation is actually the unfolding of ideas of universal intelligence. If universal intelligence said there shall be no flight, all of the physics and math and chemistry would not allow flight to take place. So it's actually an unfolding of a possibility within universal intelligence. Stevenson says that there are three classes of creation. There's matter, there's acts, and there's facts. So there is a fact called the Pythagorean theorem that tells me on a right triangle that a squared plus b squared will equal c squared. So if I have 3 units over here and 4 units over here, 3 times 3 is 9, plus 4 times 4, which is 16, is 25, which makes C5. That's a fact. That's not an act. That has no matter. It's just a fact. This works out mathematically. An act is if I punch the screen, it might break. It may not break. It's still an act, and the screen itself is matter. So the act, creation is the act of constituting or investing with a new character, title, or the like. All right, this is probably, in all of this stuff, it's probably the easiest one for us to understand, because we had to have 3 years of neuroanatomy to even graduate. So the brain cell is probably the easiest one to talk about. I'm going to break it up here. This is page 25, talks about these 6 things here. The brain cell is an organ used by innate intelligence for the assembling of the forces. It's a place where the thoughts are made. It's actually the clearinghouse for coordination. Interesting. We know about that, how brain cells talk to each other to coordinate function, to enhance or diminish intended function. It's a smaller unit of the organ called the brain. I really like this one, the workshop. This brain cell is the workshop of innate intelligence. And the brain cell is a tissue cell which is requiring mental impulses itself. It requires blood itself, and it requires serum itself. So I like to think of these as a tissue. There's 3 of these 6 that are a tissue, but all 6 of them list the brain cell as a location. And I think that fits with how Stevenson is describing this part of the normal complete cycle. And here's some really good Google found pictures with all the different parts and parcels and pieces of the nerve cell itself. And, we could spend, years, decades, lifetimes on any one part of this. But again, we're all very familiar with this. I'm not going to delve into this in any kind of depth for a philosophical talk. That's a cool one, though. I like the graphics there. All right, so transformation. This is where we're going to get into some really deep stuff here, so hang on, okay? Transformation is the changing the force from a mental realm to the material realm. So this is where it gets real. Ding. It goes from a non-physical to a physical entity at this point in the cycle. So everything up to now has been in the mental or non-physical realm. It's all been thoughts and forces. After this point and into another point, this is where it becomes material or real. Transformation is making a force out of thought. So it's taking the intelligence and transforming it to a force. Remember, we have intelligence going to force, which can only work on matter. Transformation is that process right there. And not just in a little bit, but so that it can be physical enough to get a grip on matter. So transformation is taking a thought, putting enough force behind it so it can act on matter. I'm going to take another pause real quick. I'll be right back. You won't notice much unless I magically just move on the screen. All right, I hope the image didn't jump too much for you. Thank you for that freedom to get up and take care of things and let the video jump for you. So again, transformation is making a force out of thought so it can be physical enough to get a grip on matter. Transformation, like I just said, is changing thought or intelligence to force so that it can be expressed in physical form. Transformation is a concentrating or collecting of mental forces, plural, into specific forms so that they will have a definite aim or purpose, not just a random aim or purpose. Again, we're working with intelligence here. This is considered the hardest process of the complete normal cycle to understand, or just the complete cycle to understand. And the example that is that I like to use here is writing. If I have, it's very similar to speaking, which I discussed earlier, reading this, using the image to recognize letters and the grouping of letters to recognize words and the grouping of words to recognize sentences and thoughts and trying to put all this presentation together. There's a lot of that in this too. You know, if I want to write just my initials with my mouse on the screen, my brain already knew what it was supposed to look like. And that thought created force in certain brain cells in a group of brain cells. It didn't create force in my liver to do anything except for maybe convert some sugar to fat or fat to sugar or whatever the process would be to give my muscles in my forearm enough energy so that whatever's spent on doing this activity is replenished and ready for the next activity. The thought to force also caused my voluntary muscles to, click and hold and drag, let go, click, drag, let go, click, drag, let go, click, drag, let go, click, drag, let go. And, just the whole process of writing to go from a thought to a force to expression, it really is, it might be the easiest to explain because we all experience it, but to actually explain it in detail, all the different processes, this is considered the hardest process to completely understand every procedure. It's kind of like explaining chocolate to somebody who's never tasted chocolate before. You might think it's simple until you start trying to do it. And then you throw in all the complicated paraphysical and physiological and all that stuff in there, and it just gets extremely complicated and messy, and it becomes very similar to the butterfly effect on the weather. If you don't know about that, look it up, butterfly effect on the weather. But this is a direct quote from Stevenson. It's considered the hardest process of the complete cycle to understand. So even as confusing as universal and innate intelligence was, if we really took time to unpack this could probably take several hundred sessions to really consider what it takes to change a thought to a force concentrating those forces, collecting the mental forces, specifying them, defining them, directing them, executing them for a definite aim or purpose, that is an extremely complex and hard to understand and describe process. And so it's so hard to understand that we're actually just going to go on from there. All right, now we're going to park here a little bit. Transformations, page 26, very early in the textbook. It introduces a word that even some of my more seasoned colleagues, when we presented this in October of 2017, like, wait a minute, I don't know that word. Like, I didn't invent it. It's right here on page 26. And these are people that have definitely studied Stevenson's textbook, but it's mentioned in kind of passing. But when I saw this phrase about this term forerun or forerun, it made me stop and think. Transformation, making foreruns usable in the tissue cell. So transformation is the act of making these foreruns usable in the target or tissue cell. Now, a forerun or forerun is a thought without action or form yet. And right in the text it says this is the most powerful creation in nature. Now, for Stevenson to say something like that is pretty overwhelming. To say that this thing he mentions once, maybe a half dozen times in the entire textbook, is the most powerful creation in nature. Wow. But the key is it's not connected or attached to matter yet. It's not taken force yet. This is a thought without action or form yet. A pre-thought, a pre-action, a pre-form. So, most powerful creations in nature are these foreruns. These are thoughts, ideas, dreams, goals without form or details. They are the most powerful creations in nature. I made a new friend. His name is Ben Hall. He's a former NFL player, a Clemson Tiger alumni and star from a few years ago. And he explained this even before I put this presentation together. He explained this in a very, very powerful way, or very, very impactful way. He says these thoughts without anything attached to them yet determine the rest of your life. If you're driving by a parking lot or walking by a car lot and you take a look at the truck and you say, oh, I'll never afford that, in your brain, guess what? Your innate intelligence doesn't know if you're serious or not. Your intellect, your being doesn't know if you're serious or not, so it takes it at face value. And it goes along, and this is what he says. He says, and so it says, okay, we've decided that I'm never going to be able to afford that. And guess what? You'll never be able to afford that. If you take the same exact experience and say, I'm never going to afford that, and change the thought, the pre-thought to, how can I afford that? You've laid down a challenge to all of your internal resources to figure out an answer to that challenge. And the answer to the challenge is either I'm going to make more, I'm going to save a lot, I'm going to do without, I'm going to do whatever it takes to figure out an answer to the question, how can I afford that car or that truck? And it really was impactful when I came upon this, preparing for this presentation, that this was considered such a known fact back in 1926 that it was just casually mentioned. Now, people have made careers, made millions of dollars off of this one piece of information that we have as a core part of our chiropractic philosophy. When you look at Tony Robbins, when you look at neuro-linguistic programming, when you look at some of the other speaking gurus, even Napoleon Hill, who was a contemporary of B.J. Palmer, Think and Grow Rich. When you look at all of these people that have made careers and very successful careers by any number of standards, they just took this one little part of our normal complete cycle. Actually, it's a part of transformation, taking this one concept and ran with it. And it's actually part of our philosophical discussion is these four runes are the most powerful creations in nature. What does that have to do with healing and health and expression of life and relationships and culture and community and politics and religion and you just go down the list. I mean, what does it do for our future? I think Einstein says that no problem is solved at the same level of thinking that created it. And so these ideas have to come from people of, oh, I can create this or do this in a slightly different way that totally changes how we understand that concept. We can look at some of the modern creators like Elon Musk. How are we going to solve the fossil fuel crisis, regardless of how you define it, either too expensive or destroying the universe, the environment, or too dangerous to gather, or you just go down the list of why would we even need it. He came up with an idea of harnessing existing power, sharing his ideas, and now we have, in the past 10 years, dramatically increased the efficiency and effectiveness of electric uh, automobile engines. When you step back into history, we look at Tesla. I mean, he took just basic physics and mathematics and patented cellular telephone and telegraph and all. I mean, all kinds of things that Tesla came up with. We're just now beginning to live with. Um, and this is all because they weren't limited in what they allowed their brains and their thoughts to create. And they presented it to themselves in these four runes in a way that was a challenge rather than a limitation. So that may have gotten off a little bit off the philosophical train and into a little bit of motivation. But here it is, folks. Here it is, page 26 of Stevenson's massive textbook written in 1927. He casually says, oh, and by the way, four runes are the most powerful things created in nature. And then he just keeps going on. I think we really need to focus on this, especially in our personal lives, especially in our communities, especially in our culture and our practices, and how we deal with patients, clients, how we deal with each other, how we deal with our staff, how we deal with those in power and those that we have power over. These four runes are something to be dealt with and something to be harnessed. It's a gift from universal intelligence. It's a gift from God. It's a gift from the creation. It's a gift from the designer that we can have these pre-thoughts in a way that can dramatically change the existence of everybody on the planet if we allow them to manifest themselves to the fullest. So anyway, I didn't mean to park on it that long, probably longer. I think you guys are smart enough and well-versed enough that you can take this and run with it. And I think this is something that we as a profession do well with, but I think we can also do better with since it's right here in one of our core textbooks. Again, the mental impulse. This is one that I'm not covering because, again, it was covered by Dr. Brown in September masterfully. He had several hundred references throughout his 2-hour presentation. It was done very, very well, and it was just an amazing experience. So if you don't have access to that with the ACP program or with Sherman's online CE program, make sure you go to the PSCA online and see if it's available there to you in the resources area. Propulsion. This is the last of the topics that I'm covering in this presentation, and it's going to be short and sweet, but it's as important. So we've already gone from the non-physical to the physical to the information being getting ready to be transported. So now we're into the actual transport of the mental impulse down the efferent nerve. So propulsion is the actual sending or the starting of the mental impulse. So the mental impulse, the mental force has already been created, and it's sitting there ready to be transported. And propulsion is the sending or the starting of the send of the mental impulse. Propulsion is also described as the dispatching of the message, the mental impulse, to the right tissue cell. That's important because interference happens if that message gets to the wrong tissue cell. Dis-ease, disharmony, malfunction happen if an instruction that's intended for the toenail gets sent to the kneecap. We have issues with that. Propulsion is also described as the effort which causes the mental impulse to go to the right tissue cell. So again, this is a force, this is a dispatching, this is a taking of a actual physical thing and getting it to the right place. And it is considered the force that moves mental impulse from its origin to its destination. Now, is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is it a combination of the two? Is it a modulation of frequency? Is it a modulation of amplitude? Or is it a combination of all the above? What is this propulsion? What is this force? Is it chemical in nature? Is it electronic in its nature? Is it just a description of what naturally happens when you have a buildup of mental energy that gets shifted and sent down the correct axon to the target cells? A lot of that's up for discussion. A lot of these concepts in 1927 were still new, of light acting in a wave or particle, of photon acting as both a wave and a particle as a combination. So, it's still up for discussion. Is it important to understand what method or math or physics it uses to actually accomplish its goals? Probably. I mean, we've talked about other things of less significance. But is it important for us to continue on this discussion? No. We just need to know that propulsion is taking that mental impulse, which is the thing that gets interfered with in chiropractic. Everything is leading up to this point is the transport of that mental impulse down the afferent nerve to the target cell. Why is this even in our normal complete cycle? This is the critical place for chiropractors. Up to this point, we can't directly affect with our adjustic thrust anything yet. Interference happens in the afferent nerve from and the propulsion. We actually interfere with the transmission or the propulsion of the mental impulse. That's what subluxation does. Vertebral subluxation interferes with this one step. Subluxation interferes with the transmission here. This is the only thing chiropractic directly affects is the vertebral subluxation. Now, chiropractors, the people, they can do other things in our office that have chemical and other kinesiological effects if we employ other things other than just the adjustic thrust at the vertebral subluxation. But if you think about the diagram, this is the only place that chiropractors actually work within the realm of chiropractic, which by definition is vertebral subluxation. This is where it happens. This is important to know. This is important to understand. This is what we affect directly. This is important to understand that everything's been built up to this point, and at this point of transporting the goods from the factory to the retail store, that's where chiropractors work. We work here. This is where we work. I don't know how to say it any other better way than that, other than we need to understand this. We need to think about this, and we need to act appropriately. Again, there's not a whole bunch more I can say about this because a lot of this stuff still hasn't been defined yet. We don't have tools and techniques and instruments fine-tuned enough, tuned in the right way, looking at the right things to describe this in a mathematical physics equation yet. It's there. It has to be according to universal intelligence and what it is doing. It has to be there because it acts upon physical matter. So it has to, by definition, since it's working in matter, has to fit in with the realm of physics. So we will be able to understand it someday. We will be able to describe it better someday, but that someday isn't today, especially through me, who doesn't understand even the basics enough to describe this in a way that I won't mess it up further than I already have. So, how's that for an end note? How's that for wrapping up a thing? Your speaker saying, hey, listen to me, I'm the expert, or I am an expert, and listen to me because I got something to say, and then ending with it, I don't know enough to even explain it further. I know myself well enough to know that I don't know enough to take it any further than that, and that's why I love this profession. I love this profession's philosophy. It's because we can talk about it in an adult way to propel us to make us better tomorrow than we were yesterday. So that's what I hope this does. I hope it didn't offend anybody. I don't know anything that would offend anybody in what I said today. If I did, please let me know, because that was not my intent. It was not my direction. It was not even on my mind or heart. If I caused you to think by challenging some things you thought, I won't apologize for that. That's what we're called to do as philosophers, is to challenge and to challenge each other so we think in a better, different way. And if I made mistakes, well, that should be expected as soon as you saw my face, if you know who I am, because I ain't perfect. I don't claim to be. I just try very hard sometimes to do really, really good. And then sometimes it just happens. But it was a pleasure speaking to you for this hour and a half. I hope you got something out of it. I hope it made you think a little bit more. I hope it drove you to look at actually what the textbook says. Yes, it's it's almost 100 years old. It's 90 years old this year. I understand that. A lot's been written. Go read those things too if this interests you. But having a little bit better understanding of the core philosophy of chiropractic will make you a better chiropractor, better practitioner, and hopefully drive you to be a little bit more unique and distinct from the other healing arts that are out there, because we are separate and distinct, and we need to remain that way and even become more so as our culture develops and realize, hey, chiropractic has been around a long time and is actually accomplishing a whole bunch of what they said they could. We don't need to be adopted. We don't need to be conscripted. We don't need to be absorbed into any other profession, because we are separate and distinct. And the only thing that makes us separate and distinct is our philosophy. That's why it's so important to me, and hopefully that's why it's so important to you. Anyway, so long. Carry on. Hi, pie. Don't know you, but I love you. That's why I spend my time doing this. Take care.